analysis of the conversations in this class.
No, I'm not sure you would. Good afternoon, everyone. As you can hear, my voice is still a little fried, but not too bad, and I'm feeling fine.
What is Pesach? March or April?
Pesach this year is in April.
Oh, wow.
We are, I believe, according to my wife's calendar on the wall, we are 57 days away. At home.
Oh, she has countdown.
She has a countdown to Pesach because it involves a great deal of, in order to avoid, not the cleaning, right? Because the appropriate thing to do is what we call the mitzvah bal tashchit, of not wasting,
Right.
which means in order to get ready for Pesach, you have to begin winding down your chametz consumption, because you don't want to buy a giant box of Cheerios 2 days before Pesach, because then you would have to waste it. So she begins about now, watching what's in the fridge, watching what's in the pantry, and slowly working it down so that we don't end up with a massive amount of waste.
But oats is, you can't eat oats?
Oats? Not if it has been mixed and leavened. No. It's any of the 5 grains are prohibited. You can check out my Pathway to Judaism class from last year on Pesach if you want more information. But today we're going to be talking about a different commandment. Well, actually, we're not going to be talking about a commandment. We're in Parashat Yitro, which is famous for the 10 commandments. But we're actually not going to study the 10 commandments. We've done that before. You can always go back and review. There's 1,000 pages of commentary on the 10 commandments. It's one of the most commented sections. We're actually going to look at the epilogue to the giving of the 10 commandments. So let's make sure we've got the basic idea in our heads clear. We get out of Egypt. Yay. We go across the sea. We complain. We get better. We complain. We get better. We keep going. We eventually reach Mount Sinai. And at Mount Sinai, God tells the people that something special is going to happen, and that we need a 3-day preparatory period, that the voice is going to appear. Something's going to happen at the mountain. We're not supposed to go up it. And then we get the 10 commandments. So what happened after? Right, everybody remembers the buildup because everybody remembers Charlton Heston, even though that movie was entirely inaccurate because it had him going up and getting the 10 commandments all by himself, which is not at all what has happened. And also they jumped straight to the golden calf incident afterwards, which is also not at all what happened. But what did happen? Are we having trouble over there? Okay.
Thank you. I listened.
What happened after the 10 commandments?
After the 10 commandments, the people first they say to Moses, you speak to us, because if we hear it again, we just can't handle it.
Okay, so the most important thing that we're going to start with, the people chickened out.
Right. They just can't.
Right? They can't handle God.
They can't do it.
Right? God shows up and says, "Here I am." Right? And the people go, "Ah!" Right? And that is unusual, right? Most of us, or at least have heard people, if not our own self, who say, I wish I could have the divine experience that the people had at Mount Sinai. I wish I could have been there. I wish I could have felt the theophany, this hearing of God's commandments, this feeling of it penetrating into my soul, the mountain shaking, the smoke, the fire. Apparently for the thousands and thousands of people who were there, everyone except Moses was scared out of their minds and said, I don't want to do that ever again. Which is a little weird because we're going to try and figure out a little bit about why, and more importantly than just why they might have been skittish, why Moses tries to encourage them with a rather unusual set of, praise, warning. It's a really confused section, which is one reason why, of course, the filmmakers skip it, and another reason why many of us don't quite focus on what's going on here. Yes?
Okay, so are we talking about they come up to the mountain?
Yep.
And the voice says the commandments, and they hear them.
Right.
And they say, not say Nishma, right?
Kind of, yes.
Is that
yes.
okay?
Right.
But they don't really want to actually be closer.
They don't want to be in that experience ever again.
Right. So they say,
You go, Moses, and whatever you tell us that God told you, we're good.
We're good. Right.
We'll do. We'll hear and do.
We'll do. Exactly. We'll do. We'll obey. Right? They're not saying they don't want the commandments. Right? Very important. They're not saying no to Torah. They're saying no to the personal experience of receiving the commandments
Right.
the way they had just experienced during the 10 or part of the 10. Much commentary has been spent trying to figure out if they heard all of the 10 or part of the 10 or some of the, but we're not going to get into that today.
Okay.
But the question is that they want the Torah, they just don't want to be the vehicle for reception. Right? They
Personally get
it's
involved.
kind of like, the kids are all talking about, well, can we get a study guide from the teacher? And they say, well, one kid says, well, let's go ask her. And the other kids say, well, I don't want to talk to her. You go ask her if there's a study guide. And if she gives you a study guide, then that's good. You go. Let's find out what the Torah actually describes. Because as I said, it's not just a question of you go. There's also a response from Moses, which is going to absorb most of our time.
Okay.
So we are on page 449. This is chapter 20, of course, because it's right after the giving of the Ten Commandments in the book of Shemot, the book of Exodus. And we're going to start with verse 15, right, which is right after the actual end of the Ten Commandments. And remember, if anyone ever needs a refresher, we've got the abridged versions of the Ten Commandments on the big doors over on the other side of the building.
All the people witnessed the thunder and lightning, the blare of the horn and the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they fell back and stood at a distance. You speak to us, they said to Moses, and we will obey. But let not God speak to us, lest we die.
Okay, so here we get it in black and white. The people have just experienced the most amazing divine experience ever recorded in our history, or really just about any other history as well, because usually most of those other experiences are confined to individuals at a time, and here we have thousands experiencing it, and they don't want no more, right? They are afraid. They feel like if this continues to go on, that they will die. Now, that part is a fairly common belief in the ancient world, that the exposure to the divine was more than a mortal could handle. We see it again in other parts of the Bible. One of the famous examples is the parents of Samson. Well, actually, the father of Samson. The mother knows what's going on, where they also worry about, oh no, we've seen angelic things, now we'll die. So that general kind of anxiety is not entirely unprecedented. It is nice to know, though, that despite the anxiety, they still want what God is trying to give them. They're not rejecting God, they're rejecting the experience with God. Very important distinction. But Moses responds.
Moses ran to the people, be not afraid, for God has come only in order to test you, and in order that the fear of him may ever be with you, so that you do not go astray.
Okay, what? Why? Okay, don't be afraid. I'm with Moses right there. Okay. Moses tells us, don't be afraid. And then he's going to explain. The same way that you might explain to a child when they say, oh, I think there's something in my closet. You say, don't be afraid. There's nothing in the closet, right? I'm afraid of ghosts. Don't be afraid. There's no such thing as ghosts, right? Don't be afraid. I'm afraid of spiders. Don't be afraid. The spiders can't hurt you. They can't. Right? But I'm afraid of God. Don't be afraid. It's just, a test. And God wants you to fear him, but don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. It's just so you may be afraid. Wait a minute. What is Moses trying to explain as the reason not to be afraid?
Well,
it's not so clear, right?
What do you mean by afraid? Do you mean a fear in the sense of yirat, as in awe, or fear as in afraid of punishment?
Well, the problem is it's the exact same verb that's used in both places. So he says, don't be afraid. This is only so you'll be afraid. Or don't be overawed. This is only so you'll be overawed. If you want to translate it consistently, then Moses is telling the people that they shouldn't be what God is doing this in order that they be. Which seems very, wait a minute.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Okay,
Right.
so this is the word test ever used? Or they just made that up?
No, the word that we will translate as test, nasot, is definitely in the text.
Right.
But we're going to see there is some pushback on what that word might mean.
Okay.
Right? That word is not a in 100% agreement among all of the commentators. Okay, well, maybe we can't figure out quite why this is happening, but what is the ultimate goal that Moses says is going on here?
That they won't go astray.
Right, that you will not go astray, that you will not, more specifically, sin, right? You will not transgress. It works off the same verb as this verb for sin, to chata, right, a chet. So the idea here is that God, don't be afraid. God is blah, 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 so you don't sin. So you don't break the commandments that we've just been given. Okay, so that makes it even more important then to understand what's happening here, especially if Moses is telling them don't, what would you then expect their next reaction to be?
Not to
Okay,
be
right,
afraid, but
right.
that's
If
not what's
I
gonna happen.
well, you can't read ahead with knowledge. You have to try and remember, always try and anticipate what would the normal next step be, and that way, when it isn't, you're surprised, and then you can be elucidated by our text. Right, so the normal next step, if someone says, "Oh, I'm afraid of flying," I say, "Don't worry, flights are very safe." Blah 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 blah. I talk you into it. Now we get on the plane and we go. Here they say, we're too afraid, we can't do it. Moses is like, no, it's okay. God's just doing this. Blah 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 blah. Let's go. Except the next verse. What happens in the next verse?
So the people remained at a distance, while Moses approached the thick cloud. So it's like, don't be afraid of your teacher, but don't go too close to him.
Well, but that's the thing. Moses doesn't tell them not to. Right? Moses tells them it's okay. We can continue this experience. Right? The exposure to the divine exhortation to have the commandments as part of your life can go on like it is right now. Direct contact between the average Israelite and God. And the people say, that's too much. And Moses is like, no, it's okay. And you should expect the people would say, oh, well, okay, Moses has reassured me. But instead, they still stay back.
So they should have went ahead with
What?
Moses.
No.
Why wouldn't they? Not necessarily going up the mountain. That is something that they have been warned against doing.
Right.
But they could have continued to be in whatever state they were when they experienced the 10 Commandments. When the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 Commandments were being given to them and they experienced it. Whatever experience that was, that has traumatized them so much that they're saying, we can't have this or we'll die. When Moses reassures them that, no, you're not going to die, this is for reasons. We'll come back to the commentators to try and figure out those phenomena. They should have then agreed and said, oh, okay, you're right. We're not going to die. This is amazing. This is unprecedented. Let's keep going. But instead, Moses seems to completely fail to win them over. Right? He convinces Pharaoh. He talks God out of things, but he cannot get them to budge here.
But everything that they have seen, if we're talking to a group of people, right? Everything they've seen, from the plagues of Egypt, from the killing of the firstborn to the opening of the sea, a pillar of fire and a pillar of smoke, everything has been really ended in
Emotionally
miraculous,
overwhelming.
but emotionally overwhelming.
Yeah.
I mean, you just saw the entire Egyptian army just get crushed in waves, all right? And now
Yara, could you pass those?
you're standing in front of something that's caused literally all of this. I wouldn't be too sure. I wouldn't,
Want to back out as well?
say,
you mean-
well,
No matter how much your parents tell you there's nothing under your bed,
That's all the more
you
reason
still
why-
don't want to shove your hand under the bed in the middle of the night.
no, I'll take the flashlight and check it.
Right,
Just
so-
to be sure.
Okay, so maybe Moses just is unpersuasive because their fear is deep and they've been traumatized by everything.
Everything.
And even if it's on their side, that doesn't mean they want to go up and give it a big hug. Right? It's just a little too scary, even so. All right, well, let's see how our different commentaries try to help us understand what in the world is going on with this test and the fear and everything else that is supposed to be happening here. And maybe we can then put this into a framework or maybe multiple frameworks that will help us understand and maybe even agree with what happens. All right, so let's begin with Rashi. Always a great place to begin.
This signifies, in order to exalt you in the world, that you may obtain a great name amongst the nations, because he has revealed himself to you in his glory.
Okay, was he reading the same verse we were reading? And the answer is yes.
Yes.
Except he has a very different understanding of the word nasot, of the word that is test, right? The term that we translate in our JPS translation is that he did this in order to test you. Except Rashi's not translating that as being to test you. He's instead translating it as the second paragraph explains, with the word nasot and test in quotes.
Has the sense of exalting and greatness, of similar meaning and root to Isaiah 62, lift up an ensign or an ensign. Isaiah 49, I will lift up my standard. Isaiah 30, as an ensign on a hill. And an ensign is called
A nes.
nes because it is something raised on high.
Okay, so basically this is a banner, right? God, don't be afraid. God did this to give you a banner, right? To give you a standard under which you will stand, which will exalt you, because you'll be the people who stood at Mount Sinai. It's not a test of you. It's not something that you might pass or fail. This is God saying, you will forevermore be known as the people who were at Sinai and experienced God firsthand. And that is to your credit. That is to your exaltation. That is to the standard of your greatness that you will carry till the end of time. So you shouldn't be upset by this, right? Yeah, it's overpowering and amazing and all of that. But it's precisely because it's overpowering and amazing that this is going to be a banner that's going to give you guys the fame that you deserve for the rest of your existence.
Does this tie in with the end of the last parasha when Moses builds the altar and its name, the Lord is my banner? Nas, is that the same root?
The same root is there, exactly. The same root. This idea of having a pennant that you're holding up,
okay,
is very much in that same sense. Now, there's only a problem here, which is that's not the most natural way to translate that word. Right? The most natural way to translate that word is to, of course, translate it as test. But before we get into the testiness of it, if we do translate it in the Rashi sense, which again is based off Midrash and earlier rabbinic commentary that predates Rashi by almost 1,000 years, what he is trying to say here then, if we're going to read it back into the context, is Moses is saying, don't be afraid. Yes, it's been overwhelming, but that's because to make a spectacle that will have a lasting impression in the consciousness of the world about who you are and what happened with you at this place, it had to be overwhelming, right? To create that sense of awe and to create that power that would then convince you not to transgress. Because you would realize we're marching under this banner. We are marching under the banner of Sinai. And that will be your standard that will help you keep the standard, to make a play on the English word, right? That you will follow your flag and then you will not betray it. That sort of seems to be what Moses is saying through Rashi's interpretation. Make sense? Okay, let's look at Tur HaAruch, which is going to bring Rashi and then bring some other opinions as well.
In order to test, etc. Rashi, basing himself on the word nas, a banner, something one looks up to, understands the meaning of the line as, in order to elevate you, to grant you greater stature.
As we discussed.
Nachmanides understands the meaning to be, to get you used to supernatural manifestations in order to strengthen your faith.
Okay, so Nachmanides, in a very clever way, uses this to mean both test and miracle, right? What's the Hebrew word for miracle, which we all know from our dreidels?
Nes gadol.
Nes gadol, right? A great miracle. So Ramban, Nachmanides, is saying that this was a test in the sense that it was testing you so that you would. Remember, most of our modern educational system is testing you in order to decide whether you pass or fail. In the ancient world, the word test could also just mean to improve you, right? That you would give proof to your ability to do something. You would improve yourself through these tests and these trials, Right? You weren't supposed to just fail or pass. You were supposed to grow through that process. It's really what education is meant to be anyway, but that's a whole
Well,
other
usually
conversation.
When you buy a horse, you want a horse that's been tested.
Exactly. And that is what it's doing, because you people, you are going to be experiencing a lot of supernatural stuff, right? Your existence is now, according to Ramban, not going to go according to the regular way of the world. And you got to get used to that. And hearing God this way is part of getting you used to it. Right? This is God throwing you into the deep end of the spiritual world, and you better swim. So get used to it. That seems to be Ramban's interpretation of this test miraculous experience.
You forgot to finish it?
Mm-hmm.
People who have been granted such revelations will have their belief transformed into knowledge. As a result, they will cling more closely to their Creator.
Okay, and that brings in the second half of Moses's speech, which is, and then you won't sin, right? You are going to have this experience. You're going to have these miracles. You're going to see God in this way. That's different than everyone else in the world. And then you won't sin, right? Isn't that great? Any problems with that? What's that?
No, I was.
Oh, you agree, right? Sounds like a good plan, but is there any flaw with that plan?
Well, if you
They don't want to go.
Well, they don't want to go, and it doesn't work. The rest of the book of the Torah tells us that this generation who saw the most miracles were sometimes the least faithful.
but
Right.
compared to what they were before,
You're being very generous to them.
I am, but because I this is something I can understand deeper, that because they've had these mystical experiences, that shocks them to their core in such a way that they now know better. They may not be perfect, but they're certainly better than before.
Oh, yeah, they're definitely better, but come on.
They're getting there.
Just bear with me for a second.
I'm trying to be
You are
merciful.
all slaves, right? I
Right.
come into your midst. I lead you out of slavery after 10 amazing signs and wonders. And then I lead you through a swamp, marsh, ocean
Whatever.
that gets you to freedom
Yeah.
and destroys your enemies. And then I tell you, by the way, don't have idols. And the next thing you do is build an idol.
Right.
How powerful were those miracles for sealing the faith on your heart, for turning your experience into knowledge, which Torah Aruch is trying to say knowledge is something that will guide you, as opposed to just the experience you have, which could easily be
But
forgotten.
then but yet they had not yet really known what sin was, because they didn't know right from wrong, and I guess they had to.
Well, they knew right from wrong.
They're like teenagers. Don't drive the car after dark.
They knew
What did
that's
the
what
teenagers
they
were gonna do?
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
If we're claiming they didn't know right from wrong, then neither did the Egyptians.
Well,
And then when they threw the children into the river, that was perfectly
They
fine.
thought they would.
yeah, it's
What
like
what did they know?
It's like sending a kid off to college now. Don't get drunk.
Well, they knew right from wrong, and they prayed to God
Right.
to be delivered.
Absolutely,
And once
right.
they were delivered,
Exactly.
I understood how they could not obey him.
Well,
After all he did
Yeah.
for them.
because they are human,
They're human,
and
right.
and despite
I mean, the miraculous thing.
right, and well, that's exactly
And
what
that's-
Torah Aruch is saying, and Moses, in his opinion, is saying, which is, look, you're getting all of this experience so that you won't have to worry about making mistakes ever again, because this will absolutely rewire you, and now you will walk the right path, because there's no way you could even conceive of walking off the path. I'll be right back. They build an idol.
That's so good.
Well, and that's because the theory doesn't really work in practice.
Maybe
And then-
That's what will work miracles.
What's that?
That's why God gave up on those miracles.
It is one of the reasons. Well, and to be fair, this is one of the reasons why Purim and Pesach come back to back, right? Because Pesach is the first holiday of the year. Very important. You always remember that. For the Torah, Pesach is the first
Right.
holiday of the year,
Right.
and Purim is the final holiday of the year. Purim is the last holiday we have before Pesach. So therefore, Pesach with the overt miracles is where we mess up the most. And Purim, where we have no overt miracles, not even the mention of God's name in the entire book, is where we actually all seem to be on the same page, right? Esther says, pray for me, right? Fast for me. Everyone does. No one says, well, I'm just going to have a cheeseburger. No, they're all on the page. And we're delivered, of course, and everything goes the way we hope. So that is very much a maturation process of, is it possible to have faith without overt miracles? In some ways, it's actually easier to have faith without overt miracles because you have to generate the faith on something more substantial than just, what have you done for me lately? And that seems to be something that we're not quite there yet in the maturation of the nation. Right? They are still very much caught up, and we indeed know that one of the reasons they build the idol is because nothing great has happened lately. Right? Because Moses disappears and he doesn't come back when they expect him to. And so they're immediately shaken in their faith. Once, if you have a child that you are constantly with and you never leave alone, the first time you leave them alone, they're going to freak out. And this seems to be the problem that's going on here. So as much as I respect Torah Aruch and Nachmanides with this idea that this was supposed to improve them, I think that may be Moses' interpretation more than God's. Right? God was not necessarily expecting them to be transformed. Remember, we've talked before, it's not as though God is surprised by what comes next.
Well, there could be 600,000 different opinions. So. I'm sure if you made.
There can. And indeed, let's go ahead and take a look at some more opinions on this topic.
Another meaning contained in these words is that in the event you would complain in the future, why not every Jew has been selected to have prophetic stature? The reason is that you have now indicated you would find the burden to be God's prophet, that is to receive his communications directly, as too awesome. God has just tried to elevate all of you to the status of prophet, but you have failed this test.
All right, so Or HaChaim is a little bit more blunt, which is, there was a test and you failed it. The test was, would you like to all be prophets? And all of you but me, says Moses, said no. So guess what? Now you're not going to be. And when you come back and say, well, who made you prophet? Why do you get to have the experience with God? I can come back to you and say, you did, because you all chickened out. So therefore, it's your own fault that you don't have this prophetic experience, because you could have, but you chose not to. That was the test. You failed, but you better still not transgress as we go forward.
Yeah, maybe that is part of the plan, because isn't a community cursed when it has too many leaders?
Well, that's not what Moses' father-in-law told him at the beginning of this parasha, which was, you need help.
You need help, but you're in charge.
And Moses said, well, there's a difference between leader and leadership. Right? In terms of a final decision maker, even that we can debate about whether or not we need only one final decision maker. Judaism has done very well for the last 2,000 years without a single overarching decision maker. There's no Jewish pope. It's one of the things we talked about in our machloket, our argumentation class last Thursday. So maybe we don't always need to have one leader. And indeed, Moses later on in his career does ask that his spirit be shared on more people.
Well, that's coming up very shortly.
Well, and in Bamidbar in particular, I'm talking about we're going to talk about the elders experiencing God here in a bit, but it does seem that Moses is willing to share, and the people are not willing to pick up the slack.
Right.
And that seems to be, for Or HaChaim, the test that is happening here. And we missed. And we might think, well, if I'd been there, I would have been different. But really, if it's like one out of thousands and thousands, you really think you would have been on the one side or in the thousands side?
I would have been just like,
I think for most of us, if we are truly honest,
I'm not one to go against the grain.
if we're truly honest, most of us are not actually prepared to have the experience that Moses was having on a day-to-day basis. And that probably would have fried our resolve as well. Even though we still wanted to be with God, even though we still wanted to keep Torah and all of that, we probably would not have been willing to say, I'll be a full prophet too.
What's the story about the 4 rabbis who ascend to heaven?
And the 4 who enter Arba Nichnachs Pardes,
Right.
the 4 who go into Pardes, yes. And one dies, one goes crazy,
Right.
one loses his faith, and one comes back normal.
Right.
So it's like you got a 25% chance.
But that's, perhaps something similar is happening here.
Right. And it's important to recognize that, in a sense, God is calling their bluff. You want miracles? Great, I'll give you miracles. Are you willing to be my prophets? Oh, no?
No.
Oh, I see.
No.
You want the miraculous experiences, but you don't want the responsibility of being in this intimate relationship that is the foundation of prophecy. Well, guess what? It kind of works in tandem. Yeah, there's still going to be miracles being done for you, but for yous, not for you.
So in the prophets, there's only one person who volunteers, Isaiah, right? He says, who should I send? I'll
We
go,
don't
I'll go.
get the full story of the election of each prophet
But they
for all
all
of them.
seem to be.
Well, they're
not-
all overawed. Yes.
Yeah, they don't really.
But Elisha more.
Right. I mean, Elisha is a little bit more kind of, although he says, let me just finish this up. And it's like, all right. Right. Elijah doesn't exactly seem to bow out. He's more angry at the people than he is afraid of God. So you can't just say as a blanket that they all were reluctant. Some of them do seem to have been more willing than others. But all of them indeed went through a rough existence being a prophet.
Right.
And if you were reading the book of Nevi'im, the book of prophets, and saying, would I want to be one of these guys?
Yeah, you were like, oh.
Sure, I'd love to have the eloquence of Isaiah. I'd love to have the determination of Jeremiah. I'd love to have, the poetry of Amos. But would I want to have their lives? That's rough.
That's rough.
That's rough. I
He
mean,
remembered well.
well,
That's a lot.
all right.
Oh, speak fondly of him.
Back to Rashi about this whole idea of what was really meant to be going on here.
Through the fact that you see that he is feared and dreaded, you will know that there is none beside him, and you will therefore fear him and not sin.
So the idea here that Rashi's trying to make clear is sort of what we touched on,
Right.
which is how do we both say you shouldn't fear and you should fear? Right? And the idea is that there is going to be the spectacle in order to show you that God is held in awe and esteem by the whole world, in order that you too will hold him in awe and esteem. But you shouldn't be afraid. You shouldn't be like kid with the thing under the bed, a type of afraid. Instead, you should recognize this as a motivational thing that will then put you in the right frame of mind where you will not transgress.
Well, he's trying to. There's a paradox here, essentially, that we're working through.
Partly. And one of the ways to try and work through that paradox is to try and unpack this phrase of fear, which is what Rabbeinu Bachia is going to do for us in our next paragraph. Warning, terminology used in the next paragraph may not be the same terminology that's been used in the United States pop psychology world for the last 50 years.
Mechilta understands this fear as a sense of shame.
All right. What does shame mean?
Remorse.
Embarrassment.
Is shame a positive or negative emotion?
It can be both.
What's it commonly used, though, of people?
But
Commonly
today
negative.
Yeah.
is negative.
Today, it's negative,
But-
right? The people in many parts of our society use the term shame as something that was given, that was caused, that was used as a tool to abuse people in the past. And that word, and much of the people in the past, did indeed use shame as a tool to abuse people. As if someone got divorced, they would shame them for having the divorce, right? If someone had a child out of wedlock, two young people got, carried away. There was shame that was attached to them, shame to their family. It was used very much as a social bludgeon in order to force you to conform to society's ideas. This idea, of course, is not about what society wants of you or expects of you. This idea is about what God wants of you and expects of you, and whether you agree. And if you agree, and then you consider doing something in opposition, you realize that would cause you shame. Like you would feel just the remorse, you would feel regret, you would feel deep embarrassment that you had chosen to do something that was against what was the right way of the world, what God had given us. So that's the term that sense of shame is being used here. All right, so now let's continue to unpack him.
The reason is that fear or reverence are parameters of the heart,
Right, meaning internal aspects.
whereas shame is something one recognizes in one's face. This is the reason the Torah refers to it as being on your faces. the Torah adds, in order that you will not sin, to teach us the psychological lesson that shame inhibits the commission of sin.
All right. So in order to understand this, we have to look at the actual Hebrew again. And because this is something the translation smooths over beautifully. If you go back into our verse 17, it says, that there will be irato al paneichem, right? That there will be his fear, his awe, his reverence, or in Rabbeinu Bachia's translation, shame, on your faces. Now, in our translation, they have that as be ever with you, that it will be constantly present with you, with the idea that if it's al paneichem, that if it's in your face, that means you're holding it in front of you so that you never forget it. Right? That's why the translation it's perfectly fine and acceptable, and many other commentators would agree with that. But Rabbeinu Bachia is trying to say, but if you look at the phrase on your face, what does it mean to say God's fear will be on your face? Right? And they're saying that means that it rises to the level of a visceral physical reaction when you are contemplating the violation of one of the mitzvot. Right? That you would no more do it than you would do something else that would cause you shame, that would cause the blood to drain from your face and the horrible feel of embarrassment comes from you. And so this is a different level than just respect. Right? Respect is here, shame shakes the body. And that's the level of respect that God is trying to instill in this episode. What do we think? Yay? Nay? Maybe? Meh? Everyone a little bit fried? Not just my voice?
I don't understand.
Okay, so what he's trying, so what Rabbeinu Bachi is trying to say is the text is unusual. The text says that God's fear should be on your face. And now the translation we have says that means God's fear should be in front of you, meaning you should be always in awe of God wherever you go, whenever you are. Rabbeinu Bachi says, no, it's more than that. Fear, respect, whatever way you want to translate the yirah, this Hebrew word, that's here, right? That's inside. But this is saying this needs to reach the level of this, that it needs to reach the level of a bodily reaction, the same way that shame or embarrassment reaches a bodily reaction, the blush that a person has, or the blood draining from their face when they realize that they've done something horrible. That needs to be the level of your respect of God, not just a intellectual appreciation of God. This needs to be built into you as an autonomic function of your body. That's what we're going for here, and that will keep you from transgressing. Right, the same way that you are not going to just stand up in the middle of the room and drop your pants, because my God, I'd die of shame. You're also not going to steal from this person, gossip about that person, or eat bacon, right? That it's going to have that same, I couldn't even imagine doing it, because it's just, it's that kind of feeling that would be throughout your entire body and symbolized with the effect that shame has on the face. Does that make a little more sense?
A bit.
A bit. Okay. Well, let's try Sforno. He has a different approach.
This corresponds to what Rabbi Joshua answered the Roman emperor, who had asked him when he asked to be shown God, that the emperor first look at the sun. The emperor, of course, proved unable to do so, fearing to be blinded. Rabbi Yehoshua then asked him that if he could not even look at one of God's creations, how could he expect to be able to look at God himself?
All right, so Sforno has a little more understanding, right, by basing himself off the story of Rabbi Yehoshua, which is, of course they couldn't stand looking at God. Right? We can't even stand looking at God's creation. We can't even look at the sun. And if I can't look at something God made, how much less can I look at God who made it? Right? I mean, that's even greater and more glorious than anything that God made. So clearly, the people were right. They weren't able to really stand in God's presence in that way. It was overwhelming. It was shattering to them. And of course, they couldn't do it. So maybe Moses' exhortation is a little reassuring, a little bit saying, you failed the test, but we really shouldn't hold it against them. That this is impossible for the average human being, which is why God does not make prophets out of the average human being. And only very, very few are able to rise to that station.
At least if God is an all-consuming fire.
Then the average person is not fireproof.
Right.
Now, Kedushat Halevi, one of Hasidic teachers of the late 19th, early 20th century, wants to try and help us draw some more spiritual instruction from all of this, rather than just analyzing the ancestors.
Moses refers to the reason why God decided to address the first two commandments to the people directly, not using him, that is Moses, as his intermediary.
As I mentioned, there are different commentaries. One of the most common is to say that the first two commandments were given to everybody,
Right.
but that was when they piped up and said, we can't take no more. And then the rest were given through Moses.
Right.
So with that interpretation, that's his starting point.
He, that is God, intended to deeply engrave on the people's hearts and consciousness the fact that even the most humble of them had heard these words directly from the mouth of God, so that, should the occasion arise, each of them would find it easier to offer his life for the sanctification of God's name. Having undergone the experience they had at Mount Sinai would make it easier for them to stand up to future tests.
Okay, so again, important to remember, Kedushat Levi, living late 1900s, or late 1800s, early 1900s, he is someone who saw the worst of anti-Semitism that was rising in Europe. Right? He lived to see the Shoah. So what is his interpretation here? Is that God wanted them to experience God at least a little, even though he knew it was going to blow their minds and make them say, we can't take anymore, in order that they would be willing to stand up for God, despite problems that they would face through the rest of their existence. So the test wasn't at Sinai. The test was everything after Sinai. Right? The test wasn't at the mountain. The test was once we left the mountain. The test wasn't, could we stand in God's presence? Could we not? God knew we couldn't. But God knew we were going to have to stand for God for the next 3,000 years plus. And therefore, that would be our test. And this, what God was giving to us now, this would give us the strength to survive the test that would come for our future.
That ties into what Nachmanides said, that their belief becomes transformed to knowledge as a result of clinging more closely to God.
And it comes back to the idea of Rashi, which is that this is meant to be our banner. This wasn't a test in the sense of would they, won't they. This was a test in the sense that you're going to gain this and be able to carry it forward. Right? So we didn't fail here, according to Kedushat Levi, according to Rashi, and many of the others that we've seen. Right? We didn't fail. We never could have succeeded if your test was, could you stand in the presence of God? Yes, some commentators take that view, but more take the view that this was not meant to be to our discredit. This was meant to build us up. And what Moses is saying is, don't worry, you're not going to die. God just had to do this to build you up, to give you this banner, to give you this strength, because you're going to be tested. And you're going to need to remember this to prevent yourself from sinning in the future and from falling away from the faith or being discouraged by the horrible things that will be testing you in the next 3,000 years. So it's okay. I'll go back and I'll get the rest. God never expected you to do more than this. You're fine. Which explains then why in our verse 18, the people weren't convinced by Moses, because Moses wasn't trying to change their mind. Moses expected them to not continue the experience of the theophany, of this exposure to God's voice. They had done enough. They were good. It's a very different way of reading the text than perhaps our initial read of the text, which sees the people as being a bit cowardly, as seeing the people as a bit of a loser. Whereas Moses is saying, no. This is all you were expected to do. What you're really going to do, which is hard, is live for the next 3,000 years. But right now, you've done what was expected. Good job. Take 5, I'll be back. Then they mess up, but that's a whole nother issue. All right. Finally, Guide for the Perplexed, because it's always nice to finish with Rambam, as he tries to explain what's going on with this whole testing and visions and experience and fear.
In the same sense, Moses said to the Israelites when they stood around Mount Sinai, "Do not fear. The object of this great sight which you perceive is that you should see the truth with your own eyes. When the Lord your God, in order to show your faithfulness to him, will prove you by a false prophet who will tell you the reverse of what you have heard, you will remain firm and your steps will not slide.
All right, what's another word for prove in modern English? Test. It's test. Right? When we say something's bulletproof, right, that means it has been tested that bullets bounce off of it. That's one of the few places where we use that sense of the word prove in the modern. There's also proving grounds is another term that's used. You know, that this is a chance to test something to make sure it works. So what's Rambam's interpretation here? His interpretation isn't just about the tests you're going to have that will force you to give up your life. It is about the much more imminent threat in Rambam's life of false prophets who will arise that will try to take you away from God and try to take you away from Torah. And you need to have this experience to not let yourself be pulled away by that. And that was, like I said, just as Kedushat HaLevi faced the horrible anti-Semitism of the 20th century, and that was his focus, Rambam faced the double threat of the crusading Christians and the jihadist expansion of the Muslim empire in his own lifetime.
Right.
And the people around him were being forced to give up and abandon Judaism as the governments of these different empires were forcing people to convert. And Rambam is saying, yes, those false prophets, that's your test. And that's why God made sure that you heard, I am God, firsthand, so that you would not believe anybody who said otherwise. Go ahead and finish up.
If I had come merely as a messenger, as you desired, and had told you that which had been said unto me, and which you had not heard, you would perhaps consider as true what another might tell you in opposition to that which you heard from me. But it is different now, as you have heard it in the midst of a great sight.
Right? If I tell you the sky is blue and you live in a cave your whole life, and someone else shows up and says, I'm going to tell you the sky is green, you get to pick which one of us you want to believe. But if I took all of you out of the cave and I showed you the sky and I showed you that it was blue, and then you go back into the cave because you don't have that experience every day, and someone else shows up later and says the sky is green, you're going to say, no, I saw the sky. It was blue. I may not be seeing it right now, but I did see it, and it was blue. Indeed, Yehuda HaLevi, the author of the Kuzari, uses this as one of his main distinctions of the exceptional nature of the Jewish revelation, which is that we claimed a universal revelation rather than an individual revelation. We didn't claim that it was one person who experienced this and then shared it with everyone else. We didn't claim that it was, somebody in a cave. We didn't claim it was somebody who found secret tablets. We claimed all of us were exposed to God. And we may not have gotten the full package from God because we couldn't, but we got enough of it to believe the person who was giving us the full package and not to believe anyone else who would say otherwise. It inoculated us against false prophets for the rest of time, which is a pretty good vaccine. And that idea that both Rambam and Kedushat HaLevi are trying to see what does this test mean as being a test for the future, not a test for the present, is something that allows us to then say, what are we being tested by? What is our relationship to God, and how is that tested? And how do I make sure I use the Torah as my guide for overcoming whatever those obstacles might be?
And that's also why on Shavuot, we make a thing that we all stood at Sinai. Every
Absolutely.
generation.
It is. So spiritually, the Midrash says that every soul that would ever be Jewish was there at Mount Sinai on the first day, on that day. Right? It wasn't just that particular generation, but every soul that would ever be was also there, immaterially, obviously, not physically,
Right.
and experienced it as well.
So you're held to the same standard.
Well, and you have the same,
that same.
and you have that same strength. You have that same banner. Right? You have that same standard that you could hold up and say, I stand beneath this flag of Torah, this flag of God, and I'm not going anywhere else. This is where I am. And I believe this to be true. And nothing you say or do, whether it be your own flashy miracles or whether it be the persecution and torture, is going to make me say no. And people have tried both. And we're still here. So with that, I believe that Rambam was right. I mean, and Moses was right, that this test would work. And yeah, we wouldn't avoid all sin all the time, but we did avoid enough of the mistakes that we are still here. That actually, it worked.
And it does.
It's almost like God knew what God was doing.
It does make sense because the in quote, I'm gonna say this, the weakest demanded that golden calf, and they knew they had to have heard the first two for God to be just to punish them.
Yep.
So.
And yet they did. All right, we're going to leave it there.
Well, if I can-
Thank you all.
Don't touch that stove, it's hot. There is gonna be some kids who are gonna.
Yeah.